Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for this kind invitation to be here. It's been a wonderful experience. And I'd also like to thank the translators, who I think are doing a marvelous job. So I have a lot of slides. I'm going to skip over some of them. I think the slides will all be made available to everyone after the conference, so I'm not too worried about that. I'm going to go a little quickly through this. So just a brief agenda. I'll talk very quickly about InterPARES in general, and then go into issues of ethics and trustworthiness for records and data in the cloud, and then present 3 of the tools that we've developed in InterPARES Trust that will allow you to evaluate different systems and determine whether or not cloud services are going to provide you with the capability of maintaining trustworthy records over time. So InterPARES has 4 phases. As Luciana mentioned yesterday, it began in 1998 and ran for 3 years, researching issues pertaining to digital records in databases and office management systems, and looking at records from the perspective of the creator and how they were created, focusing on developing theory and methods to make sure that records could be preserved authentic over time using methodologies of archival diplomatics. Studied these records from the perspective of the preserver. InterPARES 2, the second phase, ran for 5 years from 2002 to 2007 and looked at records from the perspective this time of the creator. So as we said yesterday, the possibility of preserving records begins at creation. They have to be created in a way that allows them to be preserved so that their reliability, authenticity, and accuracy can be assessed and relied on. Finally, InterPARES 3 took the findings from InterPARES 1 and 2 and tested them in real-world situations. So in small archives or businesses with limited resources, even if they were large, to make sure that these findings could actually be implemented. And there has been tremendous impact over time of the InterPARES project. It's seen in some of the legislation around record keeping in Italy and in China. The standards that it has influenced include the Department of Defense 5015.2 in the United States, MOREC 2, the OAIS, and as Luciana mentioned earlier today, the Canadian General Standards Board Standard on Electronic Evidence. Policies and procedures have been implementing InterPARES findings in the public and private sector, and of course it's found in curriculum for continuing education, for university training, and has been translated into many languages. And if anyone is interested in doing some Russian translations, we'd love to see these some of these products available in Russian as well. So this brings us to InterPARES Trust, which is the current phase. We're in the final year and winding up all of the studies. As her voice said, over 90 studies. I think there have been 99 studies within the project. And we're in the process of writing a book that will present the main findings, as well as everything being posted on the website. So the purpose, I mentioned this yesterday, is looking at the impact of always-on network communications technologies and cloud computing. How does this affect record keeping, record preservation, and trustworthiness of records? Everybody, I think, knows about the cloud. I'm not going to talk about that. So some of the challenges and our ethical duties, these are things that we're also discussing in InterPARES Trust. So the challenges that are most frequently discussed in the literature and in industry around cloud computing and the problems with cloud computing are what I call data-centric thinking. And again, we mentioned, I think it was Bogdan that talked this morning about how people are concerned with information as opposed to records. This is the same idea. People are concerned here about data. Is the data secure from alteration or some sort of interference? Can personal privacy, personal information be protected? How is cross-jurisdictional data flow handled? and what guarantees of continuity of service exist. How will data breaches be handled? So these are all things that are concerned with the data, the information. But as everyone here knows, we are concerned with records, and records have further requirements around them in order to ensure their trustworthiness. Mainly, the idea of assuring authenticity, reliability, and accuracy, but also the archival bond, the link between one record and the next in the same activity, and the contexts in which the records are created and used and preserved, because that context says a lot about the identity of the record. So we need a demonstrable chain of responsible custody. And this is not something that cloud service providers typically are concerned with. So the record-keeping challenges look beyond this immediate present of data-centric thinking and project into the future. And this is the record-centric thinking that we are all concerned with. Can the context of records be protected? The provenance be demonstrated? Can retention and disposition be carried out? Can access and usability be assured over time? And can intellectual rights be respected? And ethical issues as well, privacy and confidentiality, security, all of these issues around records are also part of the ethical duties that we carry out as archivists. So Luciana has described trust and trustworthy systems. So now tools. So we have developed a number of different tools that will allow an assessment of trustworthiness in cloud environments. And they really do help evaluate the benefits and the risk from the perspective of record keeping based on archival science and archival theory. So the three tools, I may not talk about all three of them, but I definitely want to talk about the checklist for evaluating cloud service provider contracts. Anytime you put your records into the cloud, you are bound by the contract with the service provider. We also have a checklist for evaluating the capacity for retention and disposition. Certainly in Canada, we haven't found any organization that is actually assured of carrying out retention and disposition for records that are in the cloud. So there are two types of record-keeping practices. The retention and disposition schedules apply to electronic records, but they're not being applied to the electronic records. They apply in principle, but they are not applying practically. And finally, a primer for managing records of citizen engagement in open government initiatives. Okay, so the contracts look at the contract itself as an instrument of trust. So this is the contract between the cloud and the service provider. And the question is, how effectively do these cloud service contracts meet the needs of records managers and archivists? So the team that was doing this work looked at boilerplate contracts that were available online. They looked at a variety of different instruments called terms of service, service level agreements, privacy policies, acceptable use policies, and they were looking at availability of cloud service providers in Canada, the United States, and a couple in Europe. And the findings are not going to be too surprising to anyone. So lots of different legal documents exist that govern the relationship between the client and the cloud service provider. And there's no standardization of what these different documents contain. So terms of service, service level agreements there's not a big difference between them necessarily. Privacy policies, acceptable use policies. There's little standardization. These documents, I'm sure you've all had a look and then just clicked through. They're often incomprehensible to the majority of users. People don't spend the time to look at them. They contain wide-ranging exclusions of liability that favor the service provider. They do not favor you, the client. And the terms may change, and you may not be told of that change or given an option of what to do in the event of the change. So regardless of jurisdiction, regardless of the sector or the industry, the common risks exist to records around unauthorized access, whether that's access of someone completely external or within the provider, privacy breach, loss of access and control, lack of transparency, lack of ability to negotiate service, location ambiguity, you don't necessarily know where your records are, and contract ambiguity. You don't necessarily know all of the terms and what they mean. And then there are specific records considerations that are often not adequately addressed in these contracts, and they cover things like data ownership, availability, retrievability, and use, data storage and archival preservation, retention and disposition, which is the subject of another checklist, security, confidentiality, and privacy, data location and cross-border data flow, and end-of-service issues and contract termination. These are all things that records managers need to be concerned with, and contracts typically don't address or don't address fully. So the checklist is a series of sections, and each section contains a number of questions. And you can take the checklist and evaluate the contract that you either have or are considering against the checklist, and then make a determination of risk at the end of your examination to see whether or not you're willing to go with that particular contract. Okay, the retention and disposition checklist, similar type of thing, and I don't think I'll talk about that, but I do encourage you to have a look at it. And then just briefly, the open government, this is a primer on the government-citizen engagement relationship. So open governments are trying to engage with their citizens, and how does that affect record keeping? So enhancing, the purpose is to enhance the awareness of the relationship between record keeping and the government citizen engagement initiatives, and to suggest approaches for addressing record-keeping issues that impact this trust relationship between governments and their citizens. And it looks at issues and suggests strategies for managing that relationship at the level of policy, of governance and management, people and personnel, standards and practices, technology, and awareness and shared understanding. It offers a plan for going through and evaluating that process in all of those different areas. And so that's, the flyover. There are a number of other checklists that are available, and everything is available online at interparestrust.org, freely available to download and use. And if you are so inclined, please translate. There's a checklist for ensuring trust in storage as a service, a checklist for comparative analysis of governmental e-services, for single sign-on systems, economic models for cloud storage decision-making, an archival standard of practice that is based on the info security standards of practice, functional requirements for retention and disposition in the cloud, which is the one that I have in the slides but didn't talk about, and the two that I did. And the checklist for evaluating cloud service contracts has been translated into several different languages. Also, key products from InterPARES 1 and 2, the benchmark requirements supporting the presumption of authenticity of electronic records. These are the guidelines for creating records that you can be confident of. Baseline requirements supporting the production of authentic copies of electronic records, and a number of other very useful documents that you can find. And that is it in a very quick nutshell. Thank you very much.